The least you know about CSS, the easier you think it is. And the more you learn about CSS, the harder it gets.
You know what? I think I'm going to focus on performance.
The first set of bosses are just the 3 major browsers. That alone is enough to make people cry.
Welcome back to another episode of Backend Banter. First things first, I do have to just kind of do some housekeeping. Season 1 is almost over. So episode 69, I'm actually not sure if that's this episode or the next one that I record, because we record them about 4 or 5 episodes in advance, but that will be the last episode of season 1, and they'll be taking a break for a while. So just know that break is coming. Today, I'm joined by Adam Argyle, famous CSS fan. Welcome, Adam.
Yo, yeah, level 1 CSS Wizard has entered the battle. I'm here. Somehow I have a really long beard, even though I'm level 1. You'd be like, did you cast spells before you had the beard? I don't know. Anyway, hi. Stoked to be here, dude.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't think it's fair to say that you're level 1 CSS. I mean, you've been doing CSS for a minute. You have a CSS podcast. What number of episodes are you guys on?
Dude, I'm in 2 CSS podcasts. There's one through Google called the CSS Podcast, and we're on season 5, and we're up to, I don't know, we're getting close to 90 episodes or something like that. And then there's the At CSS Podcast, which we're still, I think, under 10 episodes there. It's pretty new.
You guys
started
are
this year.
brand new. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, At CSS. I'm excited to go on to that podcast, and then I can share all my terrible CSS opinions with the greater CSS community.
It's perfect. It's just such a good, humble way to like start conversations. Like you got 2 different types of people that go online and they're like, I know the right way, and I'm just going to make everybody else's way sound like shit. And then, and then they get really famous. You're like, dang, dude, that person got famous fast. And then we're over here like, I am kind of just trying stuff still, and I screw up all the time, and I'm really humble about it. And so we're just like taking the like humble path instead of the
You'll have to speak for yourself. I am an arrogant bastard. Just kidding. But I do have, we are going to start off hot this episode. We're coming out of the gate with some fiery takes. What do you think about my take that CSS, and I would definitely bump, let me back it up. HTML is not a programming language. That's my first assertion. And then I would say CSS is also basically not a programming language. I do think there's some arguments to be made for CSS. I think with HTML it's irredeemable. But what's your response to that?
Oh man, I have so many responses. But I mean, like in general, there's always the pedantic person that sits down and they're like, they're all programming languages, but CSS and HTML are not scripting languages. So I guess my first retort to you is like, which one do you mean? Do you mean it's not coding at all, or that it's not a scripting language? Like you don't tell it what to do. You say what you want. And you're like, I mean languages that I tell it what to do.
So I do consider sitting down and writing HTML or writing CSS to be coding. Like, I think that falls within the like broad category of like, I am coding, right? I am writing HTML, I'm writing CSS. And because in my mind, at least, when I think of coding, I think of like, I'm getting something done through a text-based interface on a computer, right? So rather than like using a GUI, I'm using text. So whether that's like the terminal or writing a script or writing HTML or CSS, like I think all that counts and that's fine. The reason I say it's not a programming language is because I think I'm a fan of when words mean things, right? And for example, HTML is a markup language. And so I think we should call it a markup language. Same as like, I write a lot of Markdown. Huge fan of Markdown. I write so much Markdown. But like, it's not coding. It's just like a structure, a loose structure for like putting content on the page. And I look at HTML the same way.
Nice. CSS is funny. Okay, so like I can do all the same math in CSS that I could do in JavaScript, right? We have all the trigonometry functions. So I can shoot a missile with CSS, have it decay over time, include velocity, but I'm not programming. Apparently, I'm just CSSing.
You're style sheeting.
I'm just style sheeting. I empathize a lot with where people are coming from with this. The only bummer is that it immediately makes one sound inferior and one superior. I'm like, that's weird. You can't achieve your goals without kind of doing. I look at it a lot like a house. A house is fun when people build it because there's like a group of people to build it. There's specialists and they don't tend to poo-poo on each other. Like the person that does the electrical work isn't like, electrical work is real engineering. And the people doing the plumbing, they're just moving water, like, no, there's like a cool sort of like respect that everybody has for each other. And for some reason, when this question comes up, I'm always like, is someone looking to feel better that their language is like more intense or cooler than them or something like that? And then you can sit two people down. Someone solves it with JavaScript. Someone solves it with CSS, and they achieve the same thing. And why do we have to compare? Why can't we rejoice in this sort of experience?
I'm fully on board with this line of thinking in the sense that there are definitely people out there that when they say like JavaScript's a programming language and HTML isn't or CSS isn't, the implication is JavaScript's for real engineers. And then on the flip side, I think there's also people that read that and they go, ooh, I only know HTML and CSS, or I only work with HTML and CSS, so like this hurts my feelings. And my thing is basically like, no. In fact, like the blog for Boot Dev is static HTML and CSS, and I like take pride in that. I love the fact that there's no JavaScript in there. Like, and I'm happy that there's no programming language running my blog because it's static content. And so to me, it's like, yeah, we should have respect and we should be honest about what things are, whether we categorize something as, yes, a programming language or not a programming language should be really a categorization problem and not like a gatekeeping problem of like whether you're a real engineer or not, if you're like depending on whether or not you're using it to solve a given problem.
Yeah, man, I write my CSS in Linux, with my Colby or whatever. What's the really cool one for hackers? Anyway, I'm in there and I write my CSS with Vim, dude. So I'm just as cool as everyone. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm not. See, that's the thing. You mentioned like I can make a rocket fly in CSS. I can't. Like you definitely have me one up there, and you're writing in Vim. I'm over here in VS Code. So like, you know what I mean? Like it's the technologies that you choose to solve a problem, they matter, but like, just because you happen to work in HTML or CSS, I don't think makes you more or less of a web developer. But like, let's dig into the CSS one, because this is the interesting one, right? Like I said, I don't believe that HTML is a programming language, but I do think that there is a case for CSS, and it's exactly what you mentioned, which is like, especially recently, well, actually, you might need to educate me on this. CSS variables and like the ability to do a lot of more complex computations, these are like new things to CSS, right? Like you couldn't do that 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, totally. And I think CSS has been Turing complete for about 10 years before CSS custom properties. But the CSS variables we got are super powerful. I don't know when those landed. I'm not like a good historian that way, but they continue to give us more and more interesting things. People are doing now, you can wrap a value with tan and atan2, so the new trig functions, and do these really advanced, kind of like if you think about like a matrix board where everything's binary on there, on and off. People are treating custom properties like that. They're creating a matrix of properties that's representing a large amount of state. This is why you see CSS games where you're like, hey, cool, look, I'm using my keyboard and the mouse. I'm jumping over trees. I'm collecting points. I have 3 lives. The game just ended and said game over. You're like, cool, where's the JS? And they're like, there is none. And you're like, how? And then the answer is a very complicated set of custom properties and some wild query selectors or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely very capable that way. But it's just, there's like a lot of layers with any of these things that we're trying to write, and CSS just sits at this really weird layer in between. So all it can do, and it's a very functional language. Like if you go look, we've got to have over 25 or 30 languages now. Another weird thing is almost every single one of the CSS functions are pure functions, which is like the desirable side of a JavaScript library. Mm-hmm. And CSS is just delivering that by default, and they're typed. So you have like typed pure functions that are just everywhere, and everyone's like, CSS is still lame. It's no good. I also think CSS is really hard, And no one wants to admit that. And so they'd rather poop on it and be like, child's play. Look, I said color red. Now it's colors red. This is easy. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Let's get you into level 100 and see how you do at the end of this cave. Can you beat the final boss, which is that screen reader over there that your grandma's using? You're like, oh, it gets a little harder.
So I have two things. First of all, I'm glad that you brought up that it's functional, because I think this is a really, really good point. I was recently, like just a couple weeks ago, making some big updates to our functional programming course on Boot Dev. And in the introduction to like what is functional programming, which is kind of a hard thing to explain, I kind of dig down and like, you know, my point in the course at least is a big part of functional programming, maybe even the most important part, is that it's a very declarative way of programming.
Thank you. Yes. Right? I was hoping you were going there with this. Yeah.
And CSS is declarative by nature, right? Like, and I think to new programmers, sometimes the reason they'll look at CSS and go like, this isn't a programming language, is because it doesn't like execute line by line, right? It's not procedural, like you'd expect from like Python or JavaScript. But when you look at some of the most pure functional programming languages, right, like Haskell, in their kind of most pure form, where there's not a lot of I/O going on, they're declarative. That's the whole deal, right? You declare a function, you're writing like this mathematical tree of functions, and you just expect it to do its thing, right? There's some magic behind the scenes. It's actually like doing it procedurally on the hardware, right? And in the case of CSS, it's like the browser's kind of magically doing all the procedural stuff behind the scenes to render everything and whatever. But like you as the programmer, kind of writing functional code.
Yeah, that's another really fun thing to think about if you're considering the overlap between sort of functional programming and CSS, is that CSS very exclusively works on arrays. It's always essentially referencing a collection, and then you map and filter and reduce your way down to the end collection item that you wish to apply some effects to. So you could, like, I even had a course, it's not a course, but like 6 years ago, I made this YouTube series that was like CSS and JS. And I was recreating CSS simple things with JavaScript in a very functional programming way. And the amount of work that you had to do in JavaScript was really overwhelming. You're like, at first you're like, okay, like make all the paragraphs red, text red. And you're like, oh, that's easy. Oh, all right, okay, I'll just take all the elements, I'll filter them down to all the paragraphs, and then for each paragraph, I'll apply this side effect. You're like, that's great. But once you get into like nested queries, you have ors and ands and all just all the things that you would use filter, map, and reduce for. And you realize that CSS has been doing this by default out the box succinctly for this long. It kind of gives you this fun rejuvenation of like, what am I actually getting with CSS? And like, it's actually behind the scenes doing a crap load of work. If I was to do this in JavaScript, it would be a pile of code that would be hard to maintain. And here's CSS doing the job, making it look really easy. That's cool that you've seen that parallel though.
Yeah.
I like that.
In my mind, I put, and we kind of talked about this offline, but like I kind of put CSS and like SQL in a separate box in my mind. Like they're not markup languages. They're not. You could squint it. Like I'm not upset when people call them programming languages, but like I would just say that they're very domain specific programming languages, right? And CSS, as it's most widely used, I would argue kind of feels a lot more similar to something like HTML, where it's like that, just this. It's markup on top of markup, right? It's a set of styles that apply to some markup. Granted, you can do some insane stuff with CSS, as you mentioned. Like animations are hard. Some of the hardest code I've ever written in my life has been keyframes in CSS, right? Like this is not stuff that is easily approachable, right? And writing backend endpoints, backend handlers, right, for a REST API is way easier than keyframing some of these animations. So I'm definitely not going to make the case that CSS is easy.
Well, I was teasing you offline too. I was like, backend is way easier for this one simple fact, is that you get to pick the server version and everything. And that's the only thing you have to make happy, is that one server that you get to tell it to be on or off, to update, to not update, fix at a version. Dude, in CSS, we don't have that first set of bosses. You know, this is like Scott Pilgrim. The first set of bosses are just the three major browsers. That alone is enough to make people cry. Then you have to tackle whether or not you made things keyboard accessible, touch accessible, screen reader accessible if you're really being diligent. Okay, so now you've defeated 6 bosses in this dungeon, and then you're I don't know, the designer shows up and they're like, this subjective thing was wrong. And then you're like, I have to make people happy, and I have to make an old person happy and a young person happy and my product manager happy. And then, and you're like stuck in the middle of this. And CSS is also, we should throw Kubernetes in here with the like SQL and see it just because it's fun. You describe what you want. But the even harder thing about CSS is you describe what you want, but dude, it's a request. You actually don't get to force anything in CSS. So it's a very defensive language. I think
you mean like you're querying into the DOM by it's a request, or?
I mean that if I ask for even a simple thing like the text color to be red, I have no control. All I've done is requested red. Now there's multiple factors that go into whether or not that's red or not. So the first one that's kind of easy to think about is hardware. There's different versions of red, and the screen that you're on could have a color profile that makes the red a little bit more vibrant so that its own display looks super saturated. And so then all of a sudden the red on your screen and the red on my screen aren't even the same red. Then you have users coming in with things like prefers forced color mode in Windows, where it doesn't even take the color request into thing. It just makes the text its own color. So you're realizing that you're just like, all I'm doing is formulating. Okay, I like to think about it like I have a zoo. And in this one little pen of all the lions, I never know how many lions are in the pen at one time. And this is a lot like paragraphs. I don't know how many paragraphs, I don't know how many words are going to get put into this. But like a button is a good example. You're like, my button is done. And then someone shows up and they put too many words in it and it has to wrap on a new line because the button got really wide. And then your new lined button looks terrible and needs more styles to accommodate.
The marketer needs the call to action to have 6 words in it. Yeah.
And so you're constantly in this defensive state where your component is under attack. It's under attack from user preferences. It's under attack from the hardware capabilities. It's under attack from the modalities that they're interacting with it. And it's under attack from the CMS and the stuff that you're trying to jam inside of it. And so the more you try to control that element, the more frustrated you get. So as you get more advanced in CSS, you tend to become more defensive, and you don't tell it as much what to do. You tell it what not to do. And that's just a weird thing about a language. Like, how many other languages do you tell it what not to do? There's not very many. I mean, even Kubernetes, you're just like, here's very specifically what to do. Here's my ideal setup. Do everything it takes to create this ideal scenario. And yeah, it's just weird. CSS is weird. So I get it when people are like, it's frustrating. The cascade's weird. I'm like, cool, go try Shadow DOM where there's no more cascade and realize how much more styles you have to write, because the cascade is actually a lot of it is stuff you want. And there's just so many tensions. There's so many tensions.
I will say it is my least favorite programming language to write. Like, and that even breaks my rule and includes HTML, right? Like, I'd rather write HTML. I'd rather write JavaScript. I'd rather write Go on the back end. I'd rather write Python. Like, CSS is my least, well, except for Java. I always make a special case for Java. It's definitely my least favorite programming. But like, aside from Java, like CSS really truly is. And that like, and that comes from, at least historically, I've just hated designing things.
Subjective, man. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, when I'm working with a designer and I'm like copying their styles, it's definitely not as bad. But when I'm trying to build something kind of from, you know, a textual description, a text-based description of what the user wants, I fucking hate CSS because so much is just left up to me to decide. Whereas, you know, if I'm building a backend endpoint, it's like, okay, it needs to do XYZ. It's like, all right, I know that it does XYZ.
Yeah. That's why the backend is so easy. It's the ins and the outs are so well defined. Guarding things is easier. Controlling flow is easier. I mean, it has its own difficulties, so I'm not trying to say that backend is easy in general. But that also kind of comes down to this thing that's like, I like to think about layers and phases. It's like, what phase of a developer are you in, and your product? That'll change the way that you look at things, and that changes your needs. And then when you look at CSS, it's almost like the more you learn about anything, the more you learn you don't know. And so the least you know about CSS, the easier you think it is. And the more you learn about CSS, the harder it gets. HTML is actually the same way. I find HTML to be really, really difficult because it lives amongst this subjectivity also, where like accessibility is really hard because people are using your thing and they might all have a keyboard or they all have a screen reader, but they have different expectations about how that interaction should behave. Like tabs is a classic one, or you ask 5 people what tabs are and you get 5 different answers, and 5 different expectations about what keys do what and here and there. And all these things, you need the foundation of HTML. So first you need like solid content, and then you can build like something pretty and animated on top of it. Oh man, there's just so many layers. And so kind of this programming one also reminds me of, it's like, well, how hardcore are you? It's like, I don't know, are you writing ones and zeros? Then you're the most hardcore. Here's me over here. I'm writing TypeScript. That's many layers taken away from the actual hardcore coding that's happening. Anyway, this is fun. I'm just like, I love it all. And I think CSS is unique in that so many people don't like it that I'm like, oh, I like it. Hire me. I'm like, job security.
Fair enough.
Everyone who thinks CSS sucks, I'm like, cool. Send them my way. I'll just keep increasing how much I charge because AI sucks at CSS. People don't like CSS. So I'm like, maybe CSS will be the more desirable job in the field, or there'll be like the least amount there. So it's like the last one standing is the person doing the work that interfaces the program with the human. And they're like, it's just too hard to give a bot that job. So we need humans to go in and craft these things. I don't know.
I don't know if no, you're good. I don't know if every company thinks this way, but I'm a big fan just in general of like breaking down barriers between teams to the extent possible. Like, for example, DevOps was really famous for this, kind of breaking down the wall between backend developers or just developers in general and operations people, right? And kind of, as we build better tools, it's easier to just have your developers be able to deploy. And that saves a lot of time. And I think that in web development specifically, that breaking down the barrier between designers and front-end developers is also extremely important, because I'd rather have a developer who's also essentially a designer or has a really, really good eye for UI UX design than to have a designer who can't code and a developer who doesn't understand that like this button shouldn't have 17 words in it, right? You just move so much faster.
Yeah. Oh man, the chasm between designer and developer is growing year after year right now. If you look at like any design tool that's coming out right now is competing to be Photoshop still. So it's like we're in 2024, and the best thing that's out is like maybe some cool component models and some pseudo reactive variables, but we're still in the same tool that's like it starts with a fixed artboard. Like, in what world is that the reality? You're like, not one of them. So what are we even doing? I mean, other than I think that's a good expressive space. You're expressing there. You're not implementing. And so, but anyway, the divide is growing because the web platform, the browser, is insanely powerful right now. It's the number one design tool in the entire world, has the best layout engine in the entire world. And yet the designers don't have access to that at all. And so it just keeps widening. Like we have HDR colors, and Figma just barely got display P3. And the web is way ahead of that. The web is competing with HDR content coming from like Blu-ray DVDs right now. And you got Figma that's still like, we can make a green sometimes. And it's just, there's so many of these things. You have like math functions can help you make a color palette so that it bell curves, and it's like got its really vibrant colors in the middle, and it kind of eases out on the saturation towards the light and the darks. There's all these cool things that I'm like, we need to break down more of these barriers. That's essentially what I'm saying, is that the barrier right now is growing, and it kind of upsets me because I want designers. I want the people who are thinking deeply about users to feel that they have enough tools to implement and express that patience and that empathy into the component itself. But
yeah, so
we'll see.
Here's my hot take. And I have a real world example. Like, my money is where my mouth is. So I'm working with a guy right now. His name's Charlie Coppinger. Some listeners might even know him. He's a Twitch streamer, front end developer, and designer. And we're doing a project right now. He's auditing the UI UX of the boot dev site, and he's going to pass off designs to us to implement. But I'm like, you're a front end developer. Like, let's not do the thing where you give us PNGs of what stuff should look like. Like, how about you just like send us little HTML and CSS snippets, right? Like, you don't have to pull down our whole development environment and like do everything. But like, if you know you want a button to look a certain way, just give us the markup. It's like, it's very small. You know how to do it. Like, this isn't a problem. It'll save us a ton of time, and it will and I don't know exactly how he does things, but some designers design at the pixel level, right? And so sometimes what they design just like doesn't really translate to markup very well. So it's like, I don't know. I feel like in a lot of cases we should just be cutting out the middleman. And I know that we just said CSS is hard, and it is, but it's not hard when you're literally styling like one component and there's very little animation involved, right? So I really do think that like for the 90% of use cases, designers could really pick up the amount of CSS that they need in order to just like build little kind of storybook style components that, you know, they want to communicate to the engineering team.
Yeah, and Tailwind is a good mechanism for them to prototype with that then hands off really well into the end product. So yeah, I've seen really great workflows there. One of them was with a agency called ThinkMill, and their designer started getting into. They were like, "Hey, you should just try some of this front end stuff with Tailwind a little bit," and they just forgot that they told them to do that. And like a week later, the designer shows up and they're like, "Hey, here's what I built: high fidelity, interactive hover animations that were like really, really robust." And it's just because they got challenged and they tried it, and now they're basically addicted.
So I want to circle back to something you brought up earlier that I think is an interesting point of discussion, which is basically you said one of the things that is harder about front-end development as opposed to back-end development is the fact that on the back end, you're in a controlled environment. Like you've got your server, you've got your database. You don't have to worry about which version of Node you're going to run. You're just going to run the version of Node that you want to run. And in our case, Go, right? Like we ship, they're compiled binaries with Go. So, not to flex too hard, but like, it's not like we have to ship an interpreter at all. But like, you know what I mean? Like our dependencies, we get to choose them and we get to use them. Whereas in the front end world, it's people are going to run your stuff wherever the hell they want to run it. And we actually recently just ran into this problem in a big way in boot dev, where it's like, so we ship this Pyodide Python interpreter to your browser so that your browser can then interpret Python code. And that's how we do our interactive Python lessons. And, Brave browser, sometimes it just likes to block the download of Pyodide. I don't know why, but like sometimes it does. And we're still not even sure exactly under which circumstances it does and doesn't. But to the point where we just had to like do some hokey shit in our JavaScript that like detects that it's getting blocked and pops up a thing that says, hey, your browser's blocking Brave for whatever the hell reason it wants to. Maybe try Firefox or try Chrome or disable some plugins or whatever. Just not a problem in the backend world. But here's kind of my pushback is that I think it is generally true that getting to kind of an entry level amount of competency on the back end, I think that bar is a little higher than
I agree, yeah.
Like entry level competency on the front end. I think front end goes deep. I mean, so does back end, but I think like you can go deep, really deep on both. But just like getting to that point where you can kind of ship something that's like secure and reasonable, I always say it's like maybe 25% more difficult on the back end. I don't think it's like a big deal, but I think, it's going to take maybe if it took you 9 months on the front end, it'll take you a year on the back end, something like that.
I totally agree. Yeah. Initial learning is much higher on the back end. Cause I think about it too, like in the front end, especially with CSS, color red, right? You get this immediate success and it's visual. When you're in the back end, and the learning curve there was open up DevTools or figure out how to edit text in a file and reload it in the browser. Like that's the difficulty of that entry. Versus the back end, these are engines. These are powerful machines. These are houses with multiple sets of functionality that you're like, okay, so walk up to the house and turn it on. And they're like, what? I'm not at a house. So we're like, oh, this is a metaphor. It's a virtual. And then you have to just sort of like, as a backend dev, you spend a lot of time creating mental images of the parts and the pieces and the machines and these spaces that you're connecting together and that you're piping data through and stuff like that. Like, it's a very invisible thing. And so your brain has to learn to visualize and compartmentalize the functionality of these things. It's a much higher mental tax as you ramp in. Totally agree.
Yeah, it's like, what was the result of the thing I did? It's like, oh, well, now there's some strings stored in a database and AWS. It's like, where in AWS? I don't know. How do you know that they're there? Well, I guess my SQL client like would be the easiest way to check. But like, I'm pretty sure they're there. Whereas, yeah, it's like you deploy a change to a front end app and you can obviously just go test it in your browser, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, I always liked being able to show mom the stuff I worked on because my first languages were Java, PHP, and ActionScript, and SQL.
I would have quit programming probably. Anyway.
Well, hey, I mean, so many people in those courses were like so happy when their program just printed the result. And I was like, you're happy with that? And they're like, yeah, it worked. My machine is working. And I was always just like, but I want to do more. I played so many video games, dude. I'm playing Rock Band, and everywhere I go, there's like bouncing rock hands that are like springing around. There's like snakes crawling on the top of the screen. I'm like, I'm not done until my shit has snakes, man. And I want to just show my mom. I'd be like, Mom, look what I do. Here, open it up on your Black Mirror and go to this URL and you can see what I do. And like any of the back-end work I did is so invisible.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are definitely two types of programmers like that get into programming, and you and I definitely got in different ways, because I am the complete opposite in the sense that like first time I'm building a web page, I'm like, this shit ain't for me. Like, you know what? I think I'm going to focus on performance. I want to build fast code. I want to make servers go fast. I want to make code run fast. I want to build tooling that executes quickly. I never had this like, oh, I need to build something beautiful, but I've talked to a lot of people that do.
And that's how I knew I was different, dude. I was in those classes. I was also really slow to learn. Like, I try to tell people that all the time. They're like, hey, you've been coding a while. You make it look easy. And I'm like, you have no idea how difficult it was for me at first. Yeah, I was in class and I'm like, everybody else was happy with it being done. I was like, I like the way things look. And I was the weird one in the room. Right? This wasn't the majority. The majority of people in PHP and Java classes weren't people looking to make something visual. But as soon as we got to ActionScript, I knew it was up. I was like, oh, snap. This is my space. And so I finished my 2-year degree in web scripting and database administration and went to Art Institute of Seattle, and I studied animation design. And while I was doing those things and 3D and all sorts of other stuff, I got a job at an agency building web apps. And so I just knew, it was just like obvious. It was like, okay, most people don't do what I'm doing. I should probably go focus on the design side of code. It seems rare. And it ended up being a pretty good little change. But yeah, everybody's kind of got two different ways to go. It's
yeah,
how,
I
like,
think
being kind is. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, I think in a CS degree, for sure, like you're in the minority, right? Like I'm thinking back to like I went to a like small community college essentially. I mean, it was a university, but it's one of the smaller ones in Utah, and maybe 10% of the CS graduates like took a strong liking to like CSS in particular. More of them went on to be front-end developers, but like, not necessarily front-end developers that loved design. But there was another department that was full of people that were interested in like CSS and design and graphics. It just wasn't like the CS department, Yeah,
it's like the HCI, human computer interaction or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, ours was called, there was a visual technologies degree, but I think it's less of a standardized thing. It feels like every university has like maybe a different way that they do like design and animation and the interfacing with like web development courses.
I like knowing everything. I feel like it gives me this really healthy perspective. Like I was kind of briefing you earlier on like a topic where like I look at microservices or monoliths in the backend, people talking about, and they draw these diagrams out that show all the interconnected pieces, what communicates to here. They have layers, right? Things get passed down. There's inheritance models, there's data flows. And then I'm in the front end, I'm like, we're pretty much doing the same thing in just our world, our way. We still have concepts of microservices. Now we have like island architectures where we're trying to go even harder into microservices. But then you also have monoliths, and that's when the page loaded and there was just an app tag and you stuck the whole thing in there.
Yeah, just a giant
and
spot.
just a giant spa. And so we have so many overlaps. It's just the environment that our code is running, and it's just so different. And so, yeah, the one that mine's running in is just packed with chaos and uncertainty. And the backend just has a little bit more certainty, but also there's their own struggles in the back. Just like you were mentioning earlier, there's things you have to be defensive against too. You can't always assume everything's a success. If you do, you'll have a very optimistic backend that will fall over frequently whenever somebody passes something bunk. But yeah,
a lot of times the complexity of web projects, in my mind, in the small to medium phase of a web project, the majority of the complexity lives on the front end. Because you're like trying to, like, you always want great design, right? So just like out of the box, like no matter how many users you have, you might have some really pretty animations that you have to build in CSS, right? You might have, I don't know, 10 or 20 pages on your app that require you to like build this kind of really nice component architecture so that it's easy to work within. On the back end, it's like your back end should always be simple if you have small data. Like, there's no excuse for a complex backend if you have small data. That can mean small users. It can mean small data, right? If you run some sort of like data analytics or data engineering type of company or type of product. But the backend, its complexity blows the fuck up when the data gets big, right? Like the backend for YouTube, the backend for Google. It's like that architecture and that complexity. It's like 1,000 to 1 compared to the complexity on the front end of those apps. Scaling that shit is way different. Right?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, once you get into big data issues, you just start to incur. Well, in queuing, I mean, you're right. The backend can explode in complexity in so many different ways. All of our jobs are hard, and they're all important, and we're all kind of kicking ass. It's kind of, I'm just like a weirdo. I'm just very optimistic. Call it the Mormon in me. I don't know. Maybe we'll get there. But yeah, I'm just super optimistic about like. Everybody's doing great, and we're all growing, and it pretty much everybody's job is getting harder, even though we're getting better tools, better components, better this, faster. Everything is getting better, faster, stronger. Yet our jobs get more complex. And you're right, users have high expectations. They want great design now. They're like, surely it's really easy to have great design, and you're like, no. One of my favorite thing to push back on people is, remember like is Microsoft Publisher? Do you remember Microsoft Publisher?
No.
Oh shit. Okay. Anyway, you know what a brochure is though, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm like, have you ever sat down to make a brochure? It's only 3 panels. You might need a couple images and some paragraphs. Surely that's easy to make look good, right? And then everyone goes, oh yeah, I've seen a lot of really shitty brochures. You're like, that's because this stuff is hard and it's really weird and subjective. Even when a small section of it needs done, it's still tough, let alone an app which is transitioning and tries to be fluid and have all these like things that make it better. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I want to do things that are easy. I mean, what I mean is like, it's really not like, I really want us as an industry to get out of this idea that saying something is easy, saying something is hard, saying, I know how to do X or Y, that it's about gatekeeping. Because to me, it's not at all. Like, I use Go because Go is easier to me than Java, right, on the back end. And so it's not like I think that I'm less of an engineer for using Go than Java because it's easier. It's like, I think it's a better tool for the job because it makes it easier for me. So when I say something like, front end maybe doesn't explode in complexity as much as the back end in certain scenarios, I just want listeners to understand that I'm not saying like that means front end engineers aren't real engineers or you don't have to be as smart to be a front end engineer. It's just like a way that I see how web apps develop over time, and the way it really correlates in the real world at the present in my mind is just, it means that if you have that type of an app, that you just need to plan as an organization that you'll probably have more back-end developers over time. That team will probably grow faster than the front-end team for that sort of application. And it's just like these realities that we can that we can look at. And again, it's less about gatekeeping. It's more about just like keeping ourselves honest.
You watch South Park at all?
A little bit. Probably not enough to get any specific references.
Okay, so when reality showed up, they personified reality. You haven't seen him? He's an asshole. Reality's an asshole, and he shows up to this like gala ball where everybody's all dressed up all fine, and they've got tiny little glassware with stuff in it, and he just shows up and just starts knocking shit over. He's just like, reality sucks, doesn't it? It's just like, anyway, just a great South Park moment where they personified that reality can suck. And he reminded me of reality can be. I mean, they could also have done reality could be a beautiful thing also, where like there's a lot of beautiful reality moments also. But anyway, I think we should talk about CSS is typed, or wait, the BFF versus BO.
Yeah, we should definitely hit that one. So you have this take about basically backend for front end, BFF, versus back of the front. Or back end of the front end. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this was like why I pinged you, and I was like, oh, Backend podcast. I was like, oh, I know a topic that's the back of the front, and I was like, I wonder if that's been on this show before. Okay, so you just a couple episodes ago were chatting with, I suck at names. You're chatting with somebody, y'all were mentioning BFFs. So back end for the front end. For me, that's always meant you've got your abstract, very standard REST, maybe you Swagger or whatever, and you got a back end that you built with Swagger, and it's pretty typical endpoints. Maybe there's some pagination, which is a very front end required feature. You're like, why does the back end care about pages? It just gets stuff and returns it, right? Only the front end cares about pagination. So then you it grows from there though. And so to me, the back of the front end is whenever specialty endpoints were made, that were, maybe they were combining data together. So even GraphQL is very much a BFF. This is something made for the front end. It's specialty endpoints made for the front end. So that's what BFF is. And I like thinking about backend for the front end. And then the backend of the front end, or the back of the front, is you have many layers of CSS developers. So you have someone who's an architect, and this is the back of the front architect. They're going to go set up the design system. They're going to give you tokens, and many types of tokens. There's going to be global tokens, which are static and they don't change. There's going to be adaptive tokens that change based on light and dark. There's going to be tokens that are applicable to the internal nomenclature of the designers and developer relationships. What do they call that color? What do they call sizes? Are they t-shirt sizes? Are they just numbers? Are they XL, XS? There's a language that gets built into these. And once that back of the front end is done, it styles nothing. It's just infrastructure. It's just empowering the other layer of the front end that's going to consume these variables, consume these strategies, or consume these classes. You could think of Tailwind as back of the front. What does Tailwind give you out of the box?
Like, okay, all these problems are solved for me with Tailwind. So
Tailwind is your back of the front, right? And so, yeah, you get given this entire strategy, all these pre-named globals, and those are all very much in the pure function realm. Like that's what's kind of nice about CSS, very pure function style. And you're just off to town, and you're going for the races, right? You've got this strategy. So that's what the back of the front end is. And there's so many flavors of this now, especially as CSS gets more and more powerful. There's more and more opportunities for robust architecture, and that's what's cool. So I don't know if you've heard of cascade layers. It's a fun way to organize things. You've got many layers of custom properties. You'll have typed custom properties. They're called at property. You have custom types. So you can define that this variable could only be of this type or of these types. Just like in TypeScript, you're like, it could be this or that or this, like whatever. And it's just cool. So you see different, like I have a library called Open Props. It's just variables. You could think of it like Tailwind. You import the variables. What happened? Nothing. It's on you to kind of turn it into something.
And so it's essentially just a naming convention.
Yes, it's multiple layers of a naming convention. Yeah, because the first layer is usually very static. They're blunt and they describe what they are, versus the ones that describe what they're going to do. And then you have ones that get much more robust and they become very dynamic. So you have the ones that adapt between light and dark, but you have ones that are screen size aware that use the viewport unit in a calc somehow. Then you have other ones that are using container query units in a calc. And those are going to be container specific units that are going to give you all these like various superpowers. And then, yeah, you even have like another layer is like someone creates the normalize for your style, for your site. So what's resetting and what's kind of putting down a healthy base layer for all these things to layer on top of. And it's just like in the back end where you just have all these layers, you have different roles. Some people are really deep into the caves and some people are a little closer to the light. It's just a spectrum and it's just where you're at. And I just liked the back of the front. Yeah.
We have a naming problem here. because I have now heard like back of the front or backend for front end or BFF used like 7 different ways. And let me explain. So we just said, okay, back of the front, we just essentially said Tailwind was that, which this is the first time I've ever heard that. So that's like brand new to me. And again, I don't live in CSS land, so that's probably why. We just heard like backend for front end referring to like GraphQL or endpoints that have been specifically made on the backend server for the front end. I've actually never heard that one before either, I don't think. I've usually heard backend for front end to refer to like Nuxt or Next, like essentially a server that does like server-side rendering for the front end.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
But like, it's not really a backend. Like, it probably talks to a REST API or a JSON API or something that it gets data from and then like renders stuff and sends it to the front end.
It's like Hano. Hano to you is a BFF.
I don't actually know what that is. You might have to explain that.
It's kind of like the new Express.
Oh, okay, yeah. Could be. It depends on how you'd use it. Because like for example, the boot dev architecture is we've got our backend, which is written in Go, and it's just a REST API. And then we've got our Nuxt server, which is like the next version, the Next.js equivalent in Vue, that is really like a dumb server. All it does is act like a front end, but on like a cloud cloud edge server. So it like renders the HTML and sends it to the client. But like for all intents and purposes, we kind of treat it like a front end, like a client itself. We don't give it like secret keys and database access and stuff like that. It's really just like our edge rendering server is kind of how we think of it. So my assertion after all this is literally just that we have a naming problem and we got to figure out what the hell these
we don't know where the back or the front is. Yeah. Seriously, I just keep thinking of mullets. I'm like the mullet hairstyle. I'm like, where is my database in the mullet? Is that in the? Yeah, I guess that's in the back. The really long part in the back.
Can you see my mullet coming in? I'm working on it. It's
nice,
not
dude.
Not quite as long as I need it to be, but we're getting there.
It's touching your neck, so that's every once in a while. You're like, "There's something on my neck," and you're like, "Oh shit, it's my own hair." Okay.
I'm going for the Obi-Wan Kenobi hairstyle from episode 2, Attack of the Clones.
Oh, sick! Oh, I see it then, dude. I see it.
Yeah, it's coming in.
You'll look like Ewan any minute now. You're gonna look just like him.
There's nothing we can do about the face, but we can get the hair somewhat close.
Okay, last topic that's fun is that CSS is typed in the browser, and I just don't think a lot of people know that. And for a backend podcast where people are like, types are totally my friend, I like it in almost any way that I can consume it. And you're like, the front end, just can't do that in the browser. And you're like, no, CSS has been typed pretty much since day one. Every property that has a value, those values are typed, and that's why it doesn't accept them if they're of the wrong type. So you're like, okay, color 50%. You're like, sorry, percentage is not an accepted type for color. And so the browser, though, doesn't just choke and explode like TypeScript and all the other lame type programming languages. It moves on and just looks for the most recent value of that thing that it did have, or it just doesn't perform the action that it got asked to do. And it burns on. And it's just kind of like a beautiful thing.
I got to push back on that a little bit, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Because, so when I think of static typing, to me, like the biggest benefit of static typing is just that it blows up at me, like it blows up on me sooner. Rather than like dynamic
feedback.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than like a dynamic language where it's like I actually got to run it and like get to the specific line and then like see if it breaks. So like to me, the benefit of static typing is like in Go, when I run Go build, it's going to yell at me. Or even sooner, my editor, because it has the tooling built in, will yell at me immediately. So CSS is typed. The problem is, so like your editor will yell at you, right? Like if you try to assign a number to the wrong property, I'm assuming, will you get type? I don't, if it's not obvious, I don't fucking write CSS in my editor, but like, does your editor yell at you, or is there like static analysis tooling that's like very reliable for that type information?
Yes. In your editor. So you could, just no one's built it yet. Okay. So there is style int. It'll tell you in a console. It'll be like, hey, you assigned this there. This is totally going to be inapplicable. at runtime. So you can get that feedback.
CSS, this language that nobody uses. We just haven't gotten around to building the tooling yet for this.
Yeah. And so and you could even, someone could do like a .tss file to be like a typed style sheet that has some sort of interpreter that runs it through and can give you really meaningful completions. That's another thing we don't have. So let alone just getting feedback that you're putting a wrong type in there, you could get completions that would tell you and teach you what it can accept. Because the color, even just like the color one, is very complex. It's made up of multiple types. And so if you start breaking those down and you had an editor that helped facilitate that, you could get the early and often feedback. But you're right. Tooling today is not equipped to do that. We're very, very focused on JavaScript.
Because, in my world, so we use Tailwind very heavily. And I've talked about this maybe just a couple times on the pod, but the reason I like Tailwind is because it doesn't really inform your design decisions too much. It mostly just gives you like a sane way to like kind of organize your classes. But the one thing that is pertinent to this conversation is just that it ships with a way to organize your colors, right? So like you have all your Tailwind colors kind of defined in one place, and then you use them all throughout your app. And one thing I found very quickly was that not only do I need to define my colors in my Tailwind config, I also needed to define them as CSS native variables, because the few times that I do need to drop down to CSS, I still want to be able to like reference a source of truth, like use kind of this one CSS variable. And at least in my tooling that I probably haven't set up properly, I get no completion. So if I type like, -- color red and forget the E, I'm not going to figure that out until like the red isn't showing up in the browser, which to me is like, that's the thing. That's the thing I want.
Yeah, some tightness there. And that's kind of what happens with a lot of the, CSS and JS. You would get a lot of that feedback. This is all fun stuff, though. I feel like this is like juicy, untalked about concepts. So I don't know. Hopefully it's fun for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. No, I've been enjoying it a lot. So last thing before we go is just that you mentioned that you are also an ex-Mormon. I'm an ex-Mormon. You're an ex-Mormon. And I just really quickly wanted to kind of get your take on why the hell are there so many Mormons and ex-Mormons in the web dev influencer, if you can even call us that, like circle. What's going on there? It feels like you turn around, there's another person from Utah with a podcast about code.
Oh, that's funny. There should be, okay, I do. I have a few theories. I feel like the Mormon church is very good at being happy. There's like a positivity thing that like, we go there. I mean, people go to church because they want to feel good. So it's nice if you go to a church where everybody's acting happy. That's like step one. And so you get really good at like being happy because you kind of fake happy. I don't know. So it's like, and you're optimistic and you're looking at a lot of the good things in life. I don't know. But it also comes down to, I was doing talks when I was really young. Like you just get called to do a talk. It's not like, hey, do you want to give a talk? To be like, no, Adam, you're talking on Sunday. And you're like, about
and
what?
like, you don't really say no. It's like Bishop says, no. Hey, could you give a 10-minute talk at church on Sunday? And you're 12. And it's like, yeah, I guess I'm doing that now.
Yeah, dude, bearing your testimony. You get in front of strangers and share something raw and honest. These are intense training to be a public speaker. Then folks serve a mission. They're on the ground selling something. This is a very much a dev. Dude, I've never said it before, but a mission is Mormon Dev Rel.
Yeah, it is. It's and it's
so they come back, right? And it's like, so they come back from this thing and they've got exquisite articulation skills where you have to meet people in the moment and be able to defend something and advocate for something. I guess we used to be called dev advocates. And so a Mormon missionary is a church advocate. And so it makes sense that like an advocate in one space can become passionate and love their craft, love their work. And especially if whether they're in the church or out, it doesn't matter. It seems to be that these folks come with the same skills. And some of it's even very suave. Like there's like a comfortableness to many of these Mormon public speakers. And I don't know, it just seems to really work out. So I felt like I was primed for that for some reason. That and I had sales jobs growing up, which were also very similar.
Yeah. That'll do it. Cool, man. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. Sorry for that weird question at the end. I just thought it was kind of funny that we're both have a similar background. But can you just really quickly plug your stuff? Like, tell people where they can find you, your podcasts, and yeah.
Of course, yeah. So I got a website, nerdy.dev. You can subscribe to the RSS there. I still think RSS is awesome. I've got 2 podcasts. Yeah, the CSS podcast, and I have the At CSS podcast. I have plenty of content on the Chrome developers channel. I've got articles all over Chrome developers, things about CSS. So if you want to stay up to date on what's happening in HTML and CSS and UI specifically in the browser, I'm a great follow. I do a lot of I call myself a sushi chef, where I like to make beautiful dishes, but with very few ingredients, because my goal is not to wow you in so much that when you go look at how I did it, you go, that's so cool, I can't use a single piece of it. I want you to look at it and be like, this is really cool. And wow, it's really simple. And I can see how I can extend this into more advanced scenarios. So I try to find that middle ground where it's impressive, but not too impressive. Anyway, yeah, find me there. Thanks so much.
I love that. Thanks, Adam. We'll talk to you later.
See you, Lane.